The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and red as Thomas McKenna stepped out of his small wooden cabin. The air was still cool, but he knew that within a few hours the heat would become almost unbearable. He pulled his worn hat down over his eyes and walked toward the corral where his cattle were already stirring. Ready for another day in this harsh but beautiful land, Thomas was 32 years old, though the sun and wind had carved lines around his eyes that made him look older. His hands were rough from years of hard work, and his back ached most mornings from sleeping on a thin mattress that had seen better days. But this was his life, and he had chosen it willingly. The ranch wasn't much to look at. A small cabin with one room, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and a stone corral that his father had built with his own hands 20 years ago. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and the closest town was a full day's ride through rocky desert and thorny brush. Most people would call it lonely, but Thomas preferred the word peaceful. He had not always been alone. Once, this place had been full of laughter and voices. His father had worked this land with dreams of building something great, and his younger brother Billy had run between the cattle with endless energy and joy, but that was before everything changed. Before the day that taught Thomas that loving people only meant losing them. As he walked among his cattle, checking each animal with the careful eye of someone who knew their value, Thomas remembered how different things used to be. His father had been a dreamer, always talking about expanding the ranch, buying more land, maybe even starting a small town nearby. Billy had shared that dream, following their father around like a shadow, asking a million questions about everything, from how to brand cattle to why the desert bloomed after rain. Thomas had been 27 when the Apache raid happened. He still remembered every detail of that terrible morning. He had been in town buying supplies when they came. When he returned home, he found his father shot and Billy nowhere to be found. The search party found his brother's body 3 days later, and something inside Thomas died with him. The Apache had been fighting to protect their land for years, and Thomas understood their anger. White settlers had taken much from them, forcing them onto reservations and breaking treaties. But understanding didn't make the pain any less. It didn't bring back his family or fill the silence that had settled over the ranch like dust. After the funeral, many people told Thomas he should sell the ranch and move somewhere safer. His father's friends offered to buy the land, and even some strangers came around with money in their pockets and sympathy in their voices. But Thomas couldn't leave. This place held every memory he had of his family, and walking away felt like abandoning them all over again. So he stayed and slowly learned to live with the quiet. He talked to his horses and cattle as if they were people, and sometimes caught himself setting the table for 3 before remembering he was alone. The hardest part wasn't the work or the danger or even the loneliness. The hardest part was how peaceful it felt sometimes, and how guilty that made him feel. His daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. Wake before dawn, check the animals, repair whatever needed fixing, and try to keep busy until exhaustion made sleep possible. He had 30 head of cattle, which was enough to make a modest living if he was careful. 3 horses helped him work the land, and a small vegetable garden behind the cabin provided most of his food. Thomas had become skilled at things he never thought he would need to know. He could set a broken bone on a cow, repair a roof with whatever materials he could find, and make a pot of beans last for days. He had learned to cut his own hair with a knife and mirror, and to darn his socks when they wore through. Independence had been forced upon him, but he wore it like armor against a world that seemed determined to take everything he cared about. The other ranchers in the area respected him, though they worried about him living so far from help. When they gathered in town for supplies or news, they always asked about Thomas, wondering if he was finally ready to rejoin the world of people. He appreciated their concern, but he had no interest in their conversations about weather and cattle prices, and who was marrying whom. Sometimes traders or travelers would stop at his ranch, drawn by the well that his father had dug near a natural spring. Thomas always shared his water freely and usually offered a meal to anyone who looked hungry. These brief encounters with other people reminded him that he still knew how to talk and laugh, But they also reminded him why he preferred solitude. People asked him many questions and expected him to care about things that seemed unimportant. The desert around his ranch was both dangerous and beautiful. During the day, the heat could kill a person who wasn't careful, and at night, the cold could be just as deadly. Rattlesnakes hid in the shadows, and mountain lions sometimes came down from the hills looking for easy prey. But Thomas had learned to read the land like a book, understanding its moods and seasons, knowing where to find water and shelter when he needed them. He had also learned to appreciate the desert's strange beauty, the way the mountains changed color throughout the day, from purple in the early morning to red at sunset, the sudden bloom of wildflowers after a rare rain, the absolute silence that could fall over the land, so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. These moments of wonder helped balance the grief that still lived in his chest like a weight he carried everywhere. Thomas knew that people in town thought he was becoming strange, maybe even a little crazy. They whispered about the hermit rancher, who talked to animals and lived like a ghost in the desert. Some said he was dangerous, driven mad by isolation and loss. Others felt sorry for him. This man who had once been part of a family and now lived like he was the only person left in the world. But Thomas didn't feel crazy or dangerous. He felt careful. Careful not to hope too much or love too deeply, because he had learned that life could snatch away everything good without warning. His heart had closed like a flower in winter, and he intended to keep it that way. As the sun reached its highest point, and the heat began to shimmer off the rocks, Thomas finished his morning work and headed back to the cabin. Inside he would eat a simple lunch and rest during the hottest part of the day, reading one of the few books he owned or working on small repairs that didn't require him to be outside. He had no way of knowing that his carefully ordered, solitary life was about to be turned upside down. He had no idea that within a few days he would find someone who would challenge everything he believed about safety and love, and the wisdom of keeping his heart locked away. Thomas McKenna thought he had found peace in his loneliness, but he was about to discover that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the greatest rewards. The desert wind whispered through the canyon walls, carrying secrets and possibilities that Thomas could not yet imagine. His story of love and sacrifice was about to begin, though he would not know it until he looked into the eyes of a wounded stranger and felt his careful walls begin to crumble. The morning started like any other for Thomas. He had finished his coffee and was saddling his horse when he noticed something was wrong. 3 of his cattle were missing from the northern pasture, and the fence post looked disturbed. In this harsh country, cattle didn't just wander off. Either they had found a break in the fence, or something had spooked them badly enough to make them run. Thomas loaded his rifle and rode north toward the rocky hills where his property bordered the open desert. The sun was already hot on his back, and he squinted against the glare as he followed the trail of hoofprints and broken brush. His horse, a steady brown Marais named Belle, picked her way carefully through the scattered rocks and thorny bush. After an hour of tracking, Thomas found his cattle gathered near the natural spring that marked the far edge of his land. They seemed nervous, shifting and lowing softly as if something had frightened them during the night. He was counting them to make sure all 3 were there when Belle suddenly threw her head up and snorted. Her ears pointed toward a cluster of large boulders near the water. Thomas dismounted and approached slowly, his hand resting on his rifle. Living alone in the desert had taught him to be careful of anything unexpected. Bears sometimes came down from the mountains, and mountain lions were always a threat. But as he got closer to the rocks, he saw something that made his blood run cold. It was a person. A young woman was lying motionless in the shade of the largest boulder, her long black hair spread across the sandy ground. At first, Thomas thought she might be dead, but then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but barely. Thomas had seen Apache people before, usually from a distance when they came to trade in town. But he had never been this close to one, and certainly never alone in the middle of nowhere. His first instinct was to get back on his horse and ride away as fast as possible. The memory of finding his father and brother flooded back, and his heart began to pound with a mixture of fear and old anger. but something made him stop. Maybe it was the way she looked so small and helpless against the huge rocks. Maybe it was the dark stain of blood he could see on her shoulder. Or maybe it was simply that she was another human being in trouble. And despite everything that had happened to his family, Thomas couldn't just leave someone to die. He knelt beside her and saw that she was younger than he had first thought, probably around 19 or 20. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and there was a bullet wound in her left shoulder that had bled through the rough fabric of her shirt. Her face was flushed with fever, and her breathing was shallow and quick. Thomas looked around nervously, wondering if this was some kind of trap. But the woman was clearly in no condition to hurt anyone, and he couldn't see or hear any sign of other people nearby. She seemed to be completely alone, just like him. He touched her forehead gently and felt the burning heat of a serious fever. The wound in her shoulder looked infected, and he could see that she had lost a lot of blood. If he left her here, she would certainly die within a day or two. If he helped her, he would be risking everything he had built for himself. For several long minutes, Thomas knelt beside the unconscious woman and fought with himself. Every reasonable part of his mind told him to walk away. Apache raiders had killed his family. The territorial government was offering bounties for captured Apache fugitives. If anyone found out he had helped one, he could be arrested or worse. The other ranchers would never forgive him, and he might lose his land entirely. But as he looked down at her face, peaceful in unconsciousness, Thomas saw something that reminded him of his younger brother. Maybe it was her youth or the way her dark eyelashes rested against her cheeks, or simply the fact that she was someone's daughter, someone's sister. The anger and fear that had lived in his heart for 5 years began to crack. Just a little. Thomas made his decision. He couldn't save his brother, but maybe he could save this stranger. Moving as gently as possible, he lifted the young woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel how thin she had become. Whatever had happened to her, she had been running and hiding for some time. Her clothes were worn thin, and her moccasins were nearly falling apart. Getting her onto his horse was difficult, but Belle stood perfectly still, as if she understood the seriousness of the situation. Thomas climbed up behind the unconscious woman and held her carefully against his chest as they made their way slowly back toward the ranch. Every few minutes he stopped to check that she was still breathing, and each time he felt a strange relief. When he felt the flutter of life still in her, the ride back to the cabin seemed to take forever. The sun climbed higher, and Thomas knew that every minute in the heat was making her condition worse. He gave her small sips of water from his canteen whenever she seemed to stir, though most of it ran down her chin. By the time they reached the ranch, her fever had gotten worse, and she was mumbling words in a language he didn't understand. Thomas carried her into his cabin and laid her gently on his own bed. It was the only real bed in the place, and she needed it more than he did. For a moment he stood looking down at her and wondered what he had gotten himself into. He knew nothing about treating gunshot wounds or high fevers. He had barely been able to take care of himself for the past 5 years, but there was no doctor within 50 miles and no one else who could help. Thomas would have to figure out how to save her life with whatever supplies he had on hand. He heated water over the fire and found the cleanest cloth he could. The bullet had gone through her shoulder without hitting any major bones, which was good luck. But the wound was badly infected, and he could see that she had been bleeding on and off for several days, working as carefully as he could. Thomas cleaned the wound and bandaged it with strips torn from his cleanest shirt. The woman stirred and moaned when he touched the injury, but she didn't wake up. Her fever was dangerously high, and he knew that infection could kill her even if the bullet wound did single quotes did throughout that first day and into the night. Thomas sat beside the bed and tried everything he could think of to bring down her fever. He bathed her face and arms with cool water, gave her tiny sips of water whenever she would take them, and changed the bandages when they became soaked with blood and infection. As the hours passed, Thomas found himself talking to her even though she couldn't hear him. He told her about the ranch, about his cattle, about anything he could think of to fill the terrible silence. Somehow, having another person in the cabin, even an unconscious one, made the place feel different. Less empty. Less like a tomb where he was waiting to die. Near midnight, the woman's fever finally broke. Her breathing became easier, and some of the terrible heat left her skin. Thomas felt a wave of relief so strong it surprised him. When had he started caring whether this stranger lived or died? As he settled into a chair beside the bed to keep watch through the night, Thomas realized that his carefully ordered life had just been turned completely upside down. He had no idea who this woman was, where she had come from, or what had happened to her. But for the first time in 5 years, he was responsible for someone other than himself. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long, cold sleep. The woman woke up on the third day. Thomas was sitting at his small wooden table, trying to eat breakfast while keeping one eye on his patient, when he heard a soft sound from the bed. He turned to see her dark eyes open, staring at the rough wooden ceiling above her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Thomas felt his heart start beating faster as he realized this was the moment he had been both hoping for and dreading. She was alive and awake, which meant his 3 days of careful nursing had worked. But it also meant he now had to figure out what to do with a conscious Apache woman who might be terrified of him, might try to run away, or might even try to hurt him. Slowly, the woman turned her head toward him. Thomas saw her take in the unfamiliar surroundings, the white man sitting nearby, and the bandages on her shoulder. Her eyes were alert and intelligent, but he could see fear there too. She tried to sit up, then winced and fell back down as pain shot through her injured shoulder. Thomas stood up carefully, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. He picked up a cup of water from the table and approached the bed. The woman watched his every move, her body tense despite her weakness. When he held out the cup, she stared at it for a long moment before accepting it with her good hand. She drank the water gratefully, and Thomas could see how dry her mouth had been. When she finished, she handed the cup back to him and spoke a few words in Apache. Her voice was hoarse from fever and thirst, but there was a musical quality to it that Thomas had never heard before. He shook his head and pointed to himself. "Thomas," he said simply. Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. The woman studied his face for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Finally, she pointed to herself and said, "Ayana." Thomas repeated the name carefully, trying to get the pronunciation right. When she nodded, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was communication over the next few days. Thomas and Ayana developed a routine that worked around their language barrier. He would bring her food and water, change her bandages, and help her sit up when she felt strong enough. She would watch him work around the cabin, and sometimes she would point to things and tell him their names in Apache. He would repeat the words back to her, usually getting them wrong, which sometimes made her smile. Those small smiles were like sunshine breaking through clouds. Thomas realized he had not seen another person smile in months, and certainly not at him. When Ayana smiled, her whole face changed, and he could see the young woman she was beneath the pain and fear. Thomas learned that she was quick to understand things, even without words. When he showed her how to take the medicine he had made from willow bark for her pain, she nodded and took it without question. When he demonstrated how to move her arm carefully to keep the shoulder from getting stiff, she followed his instructions perfectly, but communication was still frustrating for both of them. Thomas wanted to know what had happened to her, where she had come from, and whether anyone was looking for her. Ayana seemed to want to tell him things too, but they were limited to pointing and simple gestures that could only convey basic needs. The breakthrough came during the second week. Thomas was trying to explain that he needed to go check on his cattle, but he would be back soon. He kept pointing toward the door, then toward the horizon, then back to himself. Ayana looked confused and worried, and Thomas realized she thought he might be leaving her permanently. Frustrated, he grabbed a piece of charcoal from the fireplace and started drawing on the wooden table. He drew simple pictures of cattle, then himself riding away, then the sun moving across the sky, then himself coming back. Ayana watched intently, and when he finished, she nodded with understanding. But then she took the charcoal from him and began to draw her own pictures. Thomas watched in amazement as she sketched soldiers on horses, Apache people running, and what looked like an attack on a camp. She drew herself hiding in rocks, then running across the desert. When she pointed to a rough drawing that showed someone shooting at her, Thomas understood how she had gotten wounded. The drawings told a story that made Thomas's stomach turn. Soldiers had attacked Ayana's family group, and she had barely escaped with her life. She had been running and hiding in the desert for days before collapsing near his spring. Thomas realized that if he hadn't found her, she would have died alone and afraid. Far from anyone who cared about her got from that day forward, they used drawings to communicate more complex ideas. Ayana showed Thomas how her people lived, what foods they ate, and how they made clothing and tools. Thomas drew pictures of his ranch, his daily work, and even tried to explain about his father and brother. Though those pictures were harder to make. As Ayana grew stronger, she began to help around the cabin. At first, Thomas tried to make her rest, but she seemed uncomfortable being idle. She insisted on helping with small tasks like preparing food and organizing his few possessions. Thomas was amazed at how much more efficient she was than him at almost everything. She showed him how to prepare certain desert plants that he had never known were edible. She fixed his poorly mended clothes with neat, strong stitches. She even helped him understand his horses better, approaching them with a gentle confidence that made them calm and cooperative. Thomas had always thought he was good with animals, but watching Ayana work with them was like watching magic. She seemed to speak to them in a language that had nothing to do with words. His normally skittish cattle would let her walk among them without fear, and even his most stubborn horse followed her directions willingly. But it wasn't just her skills that impressed Thomas. It was the way she moved through his space, bringing a kind of life and energy that had been missing for years. She noticed things he had stopped seeing, like how the morning light came through his window, or how the sound of wind in the canyon changed with the weather. When she was strong enough to walk outside, Ayana spent hours looking at his garden, his well, and the way he had arranged his buildings. She made suggestions through drawings and gestures that improved almost everything. She showed him how to position water containers to catch more rain, how to arrange tools so they lasted longer, and how to read signs in the landscape that he had never noticed. Thomas found himself looking forward to each new day in a way he hadn't for years. There was always something interesting about having another person around, someone who saw the world differently than he did. Even simple tasks like preparing meals became more enjoyable when they did them together, but beneath this growing comfort was always the knowledge that their situation could not last. Ayana was getting stronger every day, and soon she would be well enough to travel. Thomas had no idea what would happen then. Would she want to find her family? Would she expect him to help her? Could she even survive on her own in the desert? And always lurking in the back of his mind was the fear of discovery. If anyone found out he was hiding an Apache woman on his ranch, both of their lives would be in terrible danger. The territorial government had made it clear that anyone helping Apache fugitives would be treated as criminals themselves. Thomas tried not to think about these problems during the day, when he was busy with work and enjoying Ayana's company. But at night, lying on his bedroll on the floor while she slept in his bed, he would stare at the ceiling and worry about what would happen to both of them. He was beginning to realize that somewhere in the process of saving her life, she had started saving his too. For the first time in 5 years, Thomas felt like he was living instead of just surviving. But he also knew that this happiness was borrowed time, and soon they would have to face the dangerous world outside his small, protected ranch. The question was whether they would face it together or apart. By the end of the 3rd week, Ayana could move her arm without wincing, and the angry red infection around her wound had faded to a pink scar. Thomas knew this meant she was well enough to leave, but neither of them spoke about it. Instead, they fell into a routine that felt almost like a normal life. Each morning, they would work together to care for the animals. Ayana had a natural way with the horses that amazed Thomas. She could calm his most nervous moray with just a gentle touch and a few soft words in Apache. When she worked with the cattle, they seemed to trust her immediately, following her movements. With calm eyes instead of the usual wariness they showed around people, Thomas found himself watching her more than he should. The way she moved with quiet grace, never wasting energy or making unnecessary noise. The way she listened to everything. Around her, her head tilted slightly when she heard bird calls or changes in the wind. The way she smiled when she caught him staring, a smile that made his chest feel tight and warm. They had developed their own language of gestures and simple words. Ayanna had learned to say water, food, horse, and thank you in English. Thomas could manage good, come, and careful in Apache, though his pronunciation made her laugh. When words failed them, they used their drawings on the wooden table, creating elaborate pictures that told stories and shared thoughts. It was through these drawings that Thomas learned more about Ayanna's life before she came to his ranch. She drew pictures of her family, her mother teaching her to weave baskets, her father showing her how to track animals. She had grown up in the traditional Apache way, learning skills that helped her people survive in the harsh desert, but she also drew pictures of the changes that had come to her world. Soldiers forcing her people onto reservations, families torn apart, children sent away to government schools where they were forbidden to speak their own language. The drawings showed a way of life that was disappearing, and Thomas began to understand why she had been running when he found her. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Ayanna drew a picture that made Thomas's heart race. It showed herself walking away from the ranch, heading toward the mountains where her people lived. She pointed to the drawing, then to herself, then toward the distant peaks. Thomas stared at the picture for a long time. He had known this moment would come, but he wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt. Over the past weeks, he had grown used to her presence in ways that surprised him. The cabin felt alive when she was there, and he couldn't imagine going back to the complete silence he had lived with for so long, but more than that, he had started to care about her in a way that scared him. Not just as someone he had helped, but as a person he wanted to be around. Someone whose smile made his day better, and whose safety had become important to him in a way he didn't fully understand. Thomas took the charcoal and drew his own picture beside hers. He showed the ranch empty and sad without her, himself sitting alone at the table, the horses and cattle missing her gentle touch. Then he drew another picture showing her staying, both of them working together, both of them happy. Ayanna looked at his drawings for a long time. Then she drew something that took his breath away. She drew the two of them standing together, but around them she drew soldiers with guns, angry townspeople, and danger coming from all directions. She pointed to the picture and shook her head sadly. Thomas understood what she was trying to tell him. She wanted to stay, but she knew it was too dangerous. An Apache woman living with a white man would bring trouble that could destroy both of them. The territorial government was offering money for captured Apache people, and there were men who would gladly collect that money without asking questions. But Thomas had been thinking about this problem for days, and he had an idea that might solve everything. He drew a new picture, one that showed a man and woman standing together in front of what looked like a preacher or judge. Then he pointed to himself and to her and made a gesture that he hoped would show what he meant. Ayanna stared at the drawing, her eyes wide. Thomas felt his face grow hot as he realized what he had just suggested. Marriage. He was asking an Apache woman he had known for 3 weeks to marry him. A white rancher who lived alone in the middle of nowhere. It was crazy. It was dangerous. It was probably the most foolish thing he had ever thought of. But as he looked at Ayanna's face in the firelight, Thomas realized it was also the only thing that made sense to him. For several minutes, they sat in silence while Ayanna studied the drawing. Thomas felt his heart pounding as he waited for her response. She could laugh at him, or be offended, or simply shake her head and walk away. He had no idea what Apache women thought about marriage, or whether she could ever care about a white man the way he was starting to care about her. Finally, Ayanna picked up the charcoal and began to draw. She made a picture of herself, but this time she drew 2 different versions. In one picture, she was with her Apache family, wearing traditional clothes and living in the old way. In the other picture, she was with Thomas at the ranch, wearing white woman's clothes and living his way of life. She pointed to the first picture and said, something in Apache that sounded sad. Then she pointed to the second picture and looked at Thomas with an expression he couldn't read. She was showing him the choice she faced, and Thomas realized how much she would be giving up if she stayed with him, if Ayana married him. She would have to leave behind everything she had ever known. Her people, her language, her traditions, her identity as an Apache woman. She would have to become someone completely different. And there would be no going back. Thomas drew another picture, trying to show her that she wouldn't have to give up everything. He drew both of them learning from each other, sharing their different ways of life. He drew her teaching him Apache skills while he taught her English. He drew them creating something new together, a life that honored both of their backgrounds. But even as he drew these hopeful pictures, Thomas knew the reality would be much harder. The outside world would never accept their marriage. They would face hatred and danger from people who believed that whites and Apache should never mix. They would have to be constantly careful, always watching for threats. Ayana seemed to understand. This too? She drew pictures of the difficulties they would face, the people who would try to hurt them, the loneliness of being cut off from both their communities. But then she drew something that surprised Thomas. She drew a picture of herself alone in the desert, old and sad, always wondering what might have been. And beside it, she drew herself with Thomas, facing dangers together, but also sharing joys and sorrows. In the second picture, even though there were problems, both figures looked happier. Thomas realized she was weighing her options just as carefully as he was. Stay with him and face an uncertain but shared future, or leave and spend the rest of her life wondering about the white rancher who had saved her life and offered her his heart. As the fire burned lower, Ayana made her decision. She took Thomas's hand in both of hers and spoke a long sentence in Apache. He couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the emotion in her voice. Then she pointed to the picture of them standing together and nodded. Thomas felt a joy so strong it almost knocked him over. This brave, intelligent, beautiful woman was willing to take a chance on him, willing to risk everything for the possibility of love and happiness. He squeezed her hands gently and smiled, hoping she could see in his face how grateful and amazed he felt. But even in that moment of happiness, both of them knew they were choosing the most difficult path possible. Their love would be tested by forces beyond their control, and they would need more than just feelings for each other to survive what was coming. As they sat together by the dying fire, Thomas and Ayana were no longer a wounded stranger and her rescuer. They were two people who had found something precious together and were willing to fight the whole world to keep it. Thomas and Ayana were married on a warm morning in early autumn, with only the desert wind as their witness. They had no preacher and no legal papers, but they created their own ceremony that honored both their traditions. Thomas spoke his vows in English, promising to protect and cherish her for as long as he lived. Ayana spoke hers in Apache, her voice carrying across the canyon like a song. They exchanged simple rings that Thomas had carved from pieces of silver he found in his father's old toolbox. Ayana wore a dress that she had sewn from cloth Thomas brought back from town, but she also wore a traditional Apache necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. It was a wedding that nobody else would have recognized, but it felt real and sacred to both of them. For 3 months, they lived in a happiness that Thomas had never imagined possible. Ayana brought life to every corner of the ranch. She planted new vegetables in the garden using seeds she had gathered from wild plants. She taught Thomas how to preserve meat in the Apache way, which lasted much longer than his old methods. She even helped him build better shelters for the animals that kept them warmer in winter and cooler in summer. Their days had a rhythm that felt natural and right. They would wake before dawn and work together until the heat became too strong, then rest in the shade during the hottest part of the day. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and practice each other's languages. Laughing at their mistakes and celebrating small improvements, Thomas was amazed at how quickly Ayana learned English. Within a few weeks, she could have simple conversations, and her understanding grew stronger every day. She was curious about everything, asking him to explain how white people lived, what their customs meant, and why they did things differently than Apache people. but Ayanna also taught Thomas things he had never known about the land around his ranch. She showed him which plants could heal cuts and fevers, which animals meant rain was coming, and how to read tracks that told stories about what had happened days before. Under her guidance, Thomas began to see the desert as a living place full of information and resources, not just empty space between towns. Their nights were the most precious time. They would lie in bed and share stories from their childhoods, with Ayanna describing the Apache way of life and Thomas telling her about his father and brother. Sometimes they would just hold each other and listen to the sounds of the desert, feeling grateful for the peace they had found together. Thomas knew their isolation couldn't last forever, but he tried not to think about it. He made fewer trips to town, buying supplies in larger quantities so he wouldn't have to leave the ranch as often. When he did go, he was careful to act exactly as he always had, a lonely rancher who kept to himself and minded his own business, but their secret was too big to hide forever. The first sign of trouble came when Thomas returned from a supply run and found Ayanna waiting for him with worry in her eyes. She had seen riders in the distance, 3 men on horseback who had stopped on a hill overlooking the ranch. They had watched the place for almost an hour before riding away. Thomas tried to tell himself they were just travelers passing through, but he knew better. In this remote country, people didn't stop to look at ranches unless they had a specific reason. Someone was getting suspicious about what Thomas McKenna was doing out here all alone. The next warning came 2 weeks later. Thomas had taken some cattle to sell in town, and while he was loading supplies at the general store, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. 2 men were talking about Apache raids and the bounties being offered for captured fugitives. One of them mentioned that someone had reported seeing a woman at the McKenna ranch, which was strange since everyone knew Thomas lived alone. The other man said he had heard similar rumors and they agreed it might be worth investigating. Thomas finished his business as quickly as possible and rode home faster than he ever had before. He found Ayanna working in the garden, and when he told her what he had heard, she went very still. They both understood what this meant. Their time was running out. That night, they made plans for what they would do if anyone came to the ranch. Ayanna would hide in a cave that Thomas's father had found years ago, about a mile from the cabin. It was well concealed and stocked with water and basic supplies. If trouble came, she could stay there for days while Thomas dealt with whatever visitors appeared, but their preparations weren't enough. On a cold morning in December, Thomas woke to the sound of many horses approaching the ranch. He looked out the window and felt his heart sink. There were at least 8 men riding toward his cabin, and he could see the glint of badges on some of their coats. The sheriff had come, and he had brought plenty of help. Thomas quickly woke Ayanna and helped her gather a few essential items. There was no time to get her to the cave, so she hid in the small root cellar beneath the cabin floor. Thomas covered the entrance with a rug and tried to make everything look normal, but his hands were shaking as the riders drew closer. The knock on his door was loud and official. Thomas opened it to find Sheriff Reynolds standing there with 7 other men, all of them armed and looking serious. The sheriff was a fair man who had always treated Thomas with respect, but today his face was grim. "Morning, Thomas," the sheriff said. "We need to have a talk." Thomas stepped outside and closed the door behind him, trying to keep his voice steady. "What can I help you with, Sheriff?" "We've had reports that you're harboring an Apache fugitive on your property," Sheriff Reynolds said directly. "Now, I don't like to give much credence to rumors, but we've had multiple people say they've seen a woman here. Since everyone knows you live alone, that's raised some questions." Thomas felt sweat running down his back despite the cold morning air. "I don't know what people think they've seen, but I can assure you I'm not harboring anyone." One of the other men, a rancher named Collins who had never liked Thomas, stepped forward. "We know she's here, McKenna. We've been watching this place for weeks. We've seen her working in your garden, washing clothes by the well, doing all sorts of domestic tasks that a man alone wouldn't need doing." Sheriff Reynolds held up a hand to quiet Collins, but his eyes never left Thomas's face. "Thomas, if you're protecting someone, you need to understand the seriousness of this situation." The territorial government has made it clear that anyone helping Apache fugitives will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. That could mean prison time, or worse. Thomas met the sheriff's gaze steadily, though his heart was pounding. I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I'm not hiding anyone. You're welcome to search the property if it will put these rumors to rest. It was a dangerous gamble, but Thomas hoped that a man with nothing to hide would make exactly that offer. Sheriff Reynolds studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. All right, boys, let's take a look around. The next hour was the longest of Thomas's life. He watched helplessly as the men searched every building on his property, looking for any sign that someone else had been living there. They found evidence everywhere. Extra clothes hanging on the line that were clearly too small for Thomas. Cooking pots that had been used to prepare more food than one person would eat. 2 sets of dishes instead of 1. But the most damning evidence was what they found in the cabin itself. Despite Thomas's efforts to hide signs of Ayana's presence, there were small things everywhere that told the story. A hairbrush with long black hair in it. A dress hanging behind the door. A pair of moccasins by the fireplace. Sheriff Reynolds held up the moccasins and looked at Thomas with disappointment in his eyes. These aren't your size, Thomas, and they're Apache made. You want to tell me again that you're living here alone? Thomas knew there was no point in lying anymore. But before he could say anything, Collins and another man had found the root cellar. They pulled up the rug and opened the wooden door, and Thomas's heart broke as he heard Ayana's sharp intake of breath from below. Come on up, miss, Sheriff Reynolds called down into the cellar. Nobody's going to hurt you if you cooperate. Ayana climbed out of the hiding place with dignity, her chin held high despite the fear Thomas could see in her eyes. The men stared at her in silence, and Thomas felt a surge of protective anger at the way some of them looked at her. Sheriff Reynolds turned to Thomas with a mixture of anger and sadness. Thomas McKenna, you're under arrest for harboring a fugitive and violating territorial law. And you, miss, are coming with us to face charges as an escaped Apache. As they put chains on both Thomas and Ayana, Thomas caught her eyes and tried to send her all the love and strength he could. They had known this day might come, but nothing had prepared them for the reality of being torn apart just when they had found happiness together. Their brief time of peace was over, and now they would have to face the consequences of choosing love over the safety of staying apart. The jail in town was a small, hot building with only 3 cells. Thomas found himself locked in one, while Ayana was placed in another on the opposite side of the narrow hallway. They could see each other through the iron bars, but the guards wouldn't let them speak. For 3 days, they communicated only with their eyes, trying to give each other strength while they waited to learn their fate. Thomas had never felt so helpless in his life. He watched Ayana growing thinner and more worried each day, and there was nothing he could do to comfort her. The guards treated her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt, bringing her barely enough food to survive and refusing to answer her questions about what would happen to her on the 4th day. Sheriff Reynolds came to Thomas's cell with news that made his stomach turn. The territorial judge had decided that Ayana would be sent to the Apache reservation, where she would remain under government supervision for the rest of her life. Thomas would be sentenced to 5 years in prison for harboring a fugitive, and his ranch would be sold to pay the court costs. I'm sorry, Thomas, the sheriff said quietly. I know you thought you were doing the right thing, but the law is the law. You brought this on yourself when you decided to hide her. That night, as Thomas lay on the thin mattress in his cell, he made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't let them separate him from Ayana permanently. He couldn't let her spend the rest of her life trapped on a reservation, cut off from the freedom she loved. And he couldn't spend 5 years in prison knowing that he had failed to protect the woman he loved. Thomas had grown up on the frontier, and he had learned skills that most townspeople never needed. He knew how to pick locks, how to move silently in the dark, and how to survive in the desert with very few supplies. Most importantly, he knew that the jail's back window had a loose bar that his father had pointed out years ago, but never bothered to fix. At 2 in the morning, when the single Guard was asleep at his desk. Thomas began working on his escape. It took him almost an hour to quietly work the loose bar free, but finally he was able to squeeze through the narrow opening and drop to the ground outside. Getting Ayanna out was more difficult. Her cell window was too small for even her to fit through, and the only way to reach her was through the main door, which meant getting past the sleeping guard. Thomas crept around to the front of the building and slowly opened the door, grateful that Sheriff Reynolds always kept the hinges well-oiled. The guard was snoring softly, his keys hanging from his belt. Thomas moved like a shadow, remembering everything his father had taught him about being quiet in dangerous situations. His hand was shaking as he carefully lifted the keys, but the guard didn't stir. Ayanna was awake when Thomas opened her cell door. She had heard him moving around and was ready to leave. They looked at each other for a moment, both understanding that this was the point of no return. If they left now, they would be fugitives for the rest of their lives. There would be no going back to the ranch, no peaceful life together, no safety anywhere in the territory. But as Thomas looked into Ayanna's eyes, he knew he would rather be a fugitive with her than a free man without her. They slipped out of the jail like ghosts, leaving the sleeping guard undisturbed. Thomas led Ayanna to the stable where his horses were being kept, along with the animals that had been confiscated from his ranch. Working quickly but quietly, they saddled 2 of the strongest horses and loaded a third with supplies that Thomas had managed to gather from around town. The hardest part was getting his cattle. Thomas knew he couldn't survive in the wilderness without some way to trade for supplies, and the small herd represented everything he owned in the world. But moving cattle quietly was almost impossible, especially at night. Ayanna solved the problem with her natural understanding of animals. She moved among the cattle like a spirit, calming them with gentle touches and soft words in Apache. Under her guidance, the animals followed them out of town without making the noise that would have awakened everyone. By dawn, they were 10 miles south of town, driving 20 head of cattle toward the Mexican border. Thomas knew that Sheriff Reynolds would discover their escape within hours, and every lawman in the territory would be looking for them. They had to move fast and stay ahead of their pursuers, but they also had to keep the cattle alive in the harsh desert. The next few days were the most difficult of Thomas's life. They traveled mostly at night to avoid being seen, which meant navigating dangerous terrain in the dark. During the day, they hid in whatever shelter they could find, trying to rest while keeping watch for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders. The cattle suffered in the heat, and Thomas lost 3 animals in the first week. Water was scarce, and they had to carefully plan their route from one water source to the next. Ayanna's knowledge of the desert saved them repeatedly, as she knew places to find water and shelter that Thomas never would have discovered on his own. But their biggest challenge wasn't the desert or the cattle. It was the constant fear of being caught. Every sound made them jump. Every distant rider might be a bounty hunter. Every stranger could be someone looking to collect the reward that had been posted for their capture. Thomas learned that the territorial government had offered $500 for their return, dead or alive. That was more money than most men made in a year, and it meant that every drifter and fortune seeker in the territory would be watching for them. They had several close calls with search parties. Once, they had to drive the cattle into a narrow canyon and keep them quiet while a group of armed men rode past less than a mile away. Another time, Ayanna spotted riders approaching their hiding place just in time for them to escape over a ridge. The stress was wearing on both of them. Thomas had lost weight and developed a nervous habit of constantly checking the horizon. Ayanna grew quieter each day, and Thomas could see the worry in her eyes even when she tried to smile for his sake. 2 weeks into their journey, they encountered a group of Mexican bandits who wanted to steal their cattle. Thomas was prepared to fight, but Ayanna surprised him by speaking to the men in Spanish. She had learned the language from Apache people who traded with Mexican settlements, and she was able to negotiate a deal that let them keep most of their animals in exchange for a few head of cattle and some supplies. It was during this encounter that Thomas realized how much he still didn't know about the woman he had married. Ayana was not just the wounded girl he had found by his spring. She was intelligent, resourceful, and capable of handling situations that would have left him helpless. As they continued south, Thomas began to understand that their escape was changing both of them. He was learning to trust Ayana's judgment completely, while she was learning to make life-or-death decisions quickly. They were becoming partners in a way that their peaceful time at the ranch had never required, but they were also running out of options. The Mexican border was still days away, their supplies were running low, and they could see dust clouds behind them that meant their pursuers were getting closer. On the 20th day of their flight, they reached a point where the desert stretched endlessly in all directions. There was no shelter visible anywhere, no water source on their maps, and no clear path to safety. Thomas looked at Ayana, sitting straight and proud on her horse despite everything they had been through. She had given up her entire world to be with him, and now he had led her into what might be a death trap in the middle of nowhere. But when she met his eyes, Thomas saw no regret there. Only determination and love and a willingness to face whatever came next. As long as they faced it together, they had lost everything except each other. But as they rode deeper into the unknown desert, Thomas realized that might be enough. The canyon appeared like a miracle in the endless desert. After 3 days without finding water, with their horses stumbling from exhaustion and their cattle nearly dead from thirst, Thomas and Ayana spotted the narrow opening between two massive rock walls. It was hidden so well that they almost missed it, but Ayana's sharp eyes caught the hint of green vegetation that meant water somewhere inside. As they guided their struggling animals into the canyon, Thomas felt like they had entered another world. The walls rose hundreds of feet on both sides, blocking out most of the sun and creating blessed shade. A small stream ran down the center, fed by a spring that bubbled up from deep underground. There were trees here, real trees with broad leaves, and grass that their cattle immediately began eating with desperate hunger. But they were not alone in this hidden paradise. As Thomas was helping a weak calf drink from the stream, he heard the sound of horses approaching. His hand went to his rifle, but Ayana grabbed his arm and shook her head. She had recognized something about the sound that he missed. A group of Apache warriors appeared around a bend in the canyon, moving silently on their horses. Thomas felt his heart stop as he counted 8 men, all armed and all staring at him, with expressions he couldn't read. For a moment nobody moved or spoke. Then one of the warriors, an older man with gray streaks in his long hair, rode forward. Ayana stepped out from behind Thomas and began speaking in Apache. Her voice was respectful but confident, and Thomas could hear relief in her tone even though he couldn't understand her words. The older warrior listened carefully, then responded with questions that made Ayana's answers grow longer and more animated. Thomas stood frozen, holding his rifle but not pointing it at anyone, while the conversation continued around him. He understood enough Apache words to catch his own name being mentioned several times, and he heard Ayana explaining what had happened to them. But he had no idea whether these men saw him as a friend or an enemy. Finally, the older warrior dismounted and walked directly to Thomas. He was shorter than Thomas, but carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never backed down from anything. When he spoke, it was in English that was heavily accented but clear. I am Nate. This woman says you are her husband. She says you gave up everything to protect her. Is this true? Thomas met the man's steady gaze and nodded. Yes, sir. It's true. Nate studied Thomas's face for a long moment. She says you could have turned her over to the soldiers and saved yourself. Why did you not do this? The question was simple, but Thomas knew his answer would determine whether they lived or died. Because I love her, he said simply. And because turning someone over to be hurt when you have the power to protect them is wrong, no matter who they are? Nate translated this for the other warriors, and Thomas heard murmured conversations in Apache that he couldn't follow. Then Nate turned back to him with something that might have been approval in his eyes. My niece has chosen well, he said. Any man who would risk everything for an Apache woman when he could save himself has honor. You are welcome in our camp. Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief. Ayana came to stand beside him, and he could see tears of joy in her eyes. They had found safety at last, but more than that, they had found family. Nate led them deeper into the canyon, where Thomas discovered an entire hidden community. There were about 40 Apache people living here, including women, children, and elderly folk. They had built shelters that blended so perfectly with the rocks that Thomas hadn't seen them from a distance. Gardens grew in the fertile soil near the stream, and horses grazed in meadows that were completely invisible from outside the canyon. These were the last free Apache, Nate explained. They had refused to go to the reservations, choosing instead to live in hiding in this remote place. They survived by hunting, gathering traditional foods, and occasionally trading with Mexican settlements across the border. It was a hard life, but it was their life, lived according to their own customs and beliefs. The women welcomed Ayana like a daughter coming home. They had heard stories about the niece who had disappeared during a soldier attack, and they wept with joy to see her alive and safe. They examined her scar, praised Thomas for his skill in healing her, and immediately began including her in the daily work of the camp. Thomas was surprised by how warmly the men accepted him. He had expected suspicion or hostility, but instead, they treated him with curiosity and respect. They were fascinated by his cattle and his knowledge of ranching, skills that could be useful to their community. Several of the younger men spoke some English, and they were eager to learn about the outside world. For the first time since leaving his ranch, Thomas felt like he could breathe freely. There were no bounty hunters here, no laws that said he and Ayana couldn't be together, no need to constantly watch the horizon for danger. The canyon walls protected them from the outside world, and the Apache way of life welcomed both of them as they were. Thomas quickly learned that these people were nothing like the savage raiders that white settlers feared. They were families, trying to preserve their way of life, parents teaching their children the old stories, grandparents sharing wisdom that stretched back generations. They were skilled, intelligent, and resourceful people who had been forced into hiding by a government that wanted to control or destroy them. Nate became Thomas's teacher, showing him how the Apache lived off the land. Thomas learned to track animals by reading signs in the dirt, to find edible plants in places that looked barren, and to move through the desert without leaving traces that enemies could follow. In return, Thomas shared his knowledge of cattle raising and helped the community plan ways to improve their hidden gardens. Ayana bloomed in this environment, like a flower that had finally found the right soil. She had lived in two worlds for months, first learning to be a white rancher's wife, and then becoming a fugitive on the run. But here, she could be fully Apache again while still being Thomas's wife. The community accepted their marriage without question, understanding that love could cross the boundaries that governments tried to create. The children in the camp became especially fond of Thomas. They followed him around as he worked, asking endless questions about his cattle and his life in the outside world. He found himself telling them stories about his father and brother, and they shared Apache legends that helped him understand their culture better. But even in this safe haven, they all knew that their peace couldn't last forever. Mexican and American soldiers were working together to hunt down the last free Apache bands. Spies and informants were paid to report any sign of Apache activity, and the net was closing tighter every month. One evening, as Thomas and Ayana sat by the fire, listening to an elder tell ancient stories, scouts returned with troubling news. A large force of soldiers had been seen moving through the desert, following a trail that led toward their canyon. Someone had betrayed their location, and the hidden community was about to be discovered. Nate called a council meeting that lasted deep into the night. The options were limited and all of them dangerous. They could try to fight, but they were outnumbered 10-1. They could surrender and hope for mercy, but they all knew what happened to Apache people who trusted the government's promises. Or they could scatter and try to escape, abandoning the home they had built in this hidden place. As the debate continued, Thomas realized that his arrival had brought danger to these people who had welcomed him as family. The soldiers weren't just looking for the last free Apache. They were also hunting for Thomas McKenna and his Apache wife. The fugitives whose escape had embarrassed the territorial government. Thomas stood up in the council circle and spoke in his broken Apache, asking Nate to translate when his words failed him. He told the community that he and Ayana would leave immediately, drawing the soldiers away from the canyon. If they were captured, they would never reveal the location of this place or the people who had sheltered them, but Nate shook his head. Firmly, "You are family now," he said. "Apache people do not abandon family when trouble comes. We face danger together, or we die together. That is our way." As dawn approached, and the sound of approaching soldiers grew closer, Thomas understood that they were all about to face the final test of their courage and their bonds with each other. The hidden canyon that had seemed like paradise was about to become a battleground, and nothing would ever be the same again. The soldiers arrived at dawn, their horses thundering into the canyon like a storm breaking over the hidden Apache camp. Thomas woke to the sound of gunfire and shouting, his hand instinctively reaching for Ayana before his mind fully understood what was happening. She was already awake, her eyes wide with the terror of memories from the attack that had first sent her running into the desert. Nature's voice rang out over the chaos, calling orders in Apache as his people scattered toward predetermined hiding places among the rocks. This community had prepared for this day, knowing it would eventually come. But preparation could only do so much when facing overwhelming force. Thomas grabbed his rifle and looked for a way to help defend the camp. But Ayana caught his arm. She pointed toward a narrow trail that led up the canyon wall, speaking urgently in Apache. Thomas understood enough to know she was telling him about an escape route, but he shook his head. He wouldn't abandon these people who had welcomed him. As family, the battle was swift and brutal. The soldiers had the advantage of numbers and better weapons, while the Apache had the advantage of knowing every rock and hiding place in the canyon. But even with their knowledge of the terrain, it was clear that the community couldn't hold out for long. Thomas saw Nate fall, struck by a bullet as he tried to cover the escape of the women and children. The sight of the proud leader collapsing filled Thomas with a rage he had never felt before. This man had accepted him when his own people had rejected him. And now soldiers were destroying everything the Apache had built in their hidden sanctuary. As the fighting intensified, Thomas found himself separated from Ayana in the chaos. He caught glimpses of her helping to evacuate children through the escape routes, her face determined despite the terror around them. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had survived attacks before, but Thomas could see the fear. In her eyes, every time a bullet struck near her, the Apache defense began to crumble as more soldiers poured into the canyon. Thomas realized that staying to fight would only result in everyone being killed or captured. He began moving toward the escape trail, hoping to find Ayana and convince her to flee with him. But as he climbed higher on the rocky path, Thomas heard a scream that made his blood freeze. He turned to see Ayana pinned down behind a boulder, with soldiers approaching her position from two sides. She was trapped, and there was no way for her to reach the escape route without exposing herself. To certain death, without thinking, Thomas abandoned his own escape and ran back down into the battle. He fired his rifle as he ran, drawing the soldiers' attention away from Ayana. His sudden appearance surprised them long enough for her to break from her hiding place and start climbing toward safety. But Thomas's heroic charge came at a cost. A bullet caught him in the leg, sending him tumbling behind a pile of rocks. Another bullet grazed his shoulder, and he felt blood soaking through his shirt. He was hurt badly, but he was alive, and more importantly, Ayana was safe, for a moment. Thomas thought they might both escape. Ayana had reached a high ledge and was calling for him to follow. But as he tried to stand, his wounded leg gave out beneath him. More soldiers were coming, and he knew he couldn't climb fast enough to avoid capture. Thomas looked up at Ayana and saw the moment when she realized he wasn't going to make it. Her face went white with understanding, and she started to climb back down toward him. Thomas shouted at her to keep going, to save herself, but she ignored him completely. In that instant, Thomas knew what he had to do. If both of them stayed, both would be captured or killed. But if he created enough of a distraction, Ayana might have a chance to escape. It was the only gift he could give her, the only way to keep his promise to protect her. Thomas began firing. at the approaching soldiers, making as much noise and drawing as much attention as possible. He shouted challenges in English, making sure they focused on him instead of looking for other escapees. Every shot he fired was another few seconds for Ayana to get further away, but even as he fought, Thomas could hear Ayana calling his name from somewhere above. She had not abandoned him, despite his sacrifice. The knowledge that she was still close filled him with both joy and despair. He was glad she cared enough to stay, but terrified that his sacrifice would be meaningless if she was captured too. A soldier's bullet struck the rock near Thomas's head, sending sharp fragments into his face. Blood ran into his eyes, making it hard to see. His ammunition was running low, and he could hear enemies moving closer from multiple directions. This was how it would end, alone and surrounded in a canyon that had briefly been paradise. Then he heard a sound that gave him hope. Apache war cries echoed from the high rocks, and suddenly bullets began raining down on the soldiers from above. Some of the warriors had reached defensive positions where they could cover the escape routes. The attack wasn't over yet. In the confusion of the renewed fighting, Thomas felt strong hands grab him under the arms. He looked up to see two Apache men he recognized from the camp, friends who had shared meals with him and taught him their ways. They were risking their own lives to save him, carrying him towards safety even as bullets flew around them. The climb up the canyon wall was a nightmare of pain and fear. Thomas's wounded leg made every movement agony, and several times he nearly passed out from blood loss. But his rescuers never wavered, supporting his weight and guiding him along paths that seemed impossible to navigate. Near the top of the canyon, they reached a small cave where other survivors had gathered. Thomas saw Ayana waiting there, her face streaked with tears of relief when she saw him alive. She immediately began tending to his wounds with supplies. The group had managed to save from the camp, but their safety was temporary. The soldiers controlled the canyon floor and were systematically searching for escape routes. The survivors needed to keep moving, and Thomas knew he was slowing them down. His leg wound was serious, and infection was already setting in despite Ayana's careful treatment. For 3 days, the group moved through the mountains, staying ahead of their pursuers by traveling paths that only the Apache knew. Thomas fought to keep up, but his condition was getting worse. Fever set in, and he began having periods where he lost consciousness completely. On the 4th night, as they sheltered in another hidden cave, Thomas knew he was dying. The wound in his leg had become badly infected, and his body was losing the fight against the poison spreading through his blood. He could see the truth in Ayana's eyes. Though she tried to hide her fear behind a brave smile, Thomas took Ayana's hand and spoke the words that had been weighing on his heart. He told her that she had given his life meaning in a way he had never imagined possible. He said that loving her had been worth every sacrifice, every danger, every moment of pain they had endured together. But then he asked something of her that broke both their hearts. He made her promise that if he died, she would not give up on life. He made her swear that she would find a way to be happy again, to build a future that honored both of their dreams. Ayana refused at first, holding his hand tighter and insisting that they would face whatever came together. But Thomas persisted, using what strength he had left to make her understand that this promise was the most important thing she could do for him. As dawn broke over the mountains, Thomas felt his fever break at last. The infection that had nearly killed him began to retreat, and for the first time in days he could think clearly. Ayana's constant care, combined with traditional Apache medicines that the other survivors had gathered, had pulled him back from the edge of death. The group had reached the Mexican border during the night, and they were now in a place where American soldiers couldn't follow. They were free, but they were also homeless, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memories of the community they had lost. Over the following months, the survivors slowly made their way to a small Mexican village where mixed marriages and diverse backgrounds were more accepted. Thomas's cattle, which had somehow survived the attack and followed the group during their escape, provided enough money for the refugees to start new lives. Thomas and Ayana settled in the village, where Thomas used his ranching skills to help local farmers while Ayana became known for her healing abilities. They built a small house with their own hands, creating a home that honored both of their cultures and backgrounds. Years later, as Thomas sat on his porch watching his children play in the yard, he thought about the promise Ayana had made in that cave. She had kept her word, building a life full of joy and purpose despite everything they had lost. But more than that, she had helped him keep his own promise to live fully and love completely. Their story had begun with a wounded stranger and a lonely rancher, two people from different worlds who should never have met. But it had become something larger, a testament to the power of love to cross any boundary and overcome any obstacle. Thomas had lost his ranch, his old life, and nearly his life itself. But in return, he had gained something infinitely more valuable. He had learned that home wasn't a place you owned, but the person you chose to share your heart with, no matter where that journey might lead.